Good evening, ladies and gents, boys and girls, near and far. You are tuning in live on Genvièv TV, and I am Genvièv. And tonight we're going to talk about the reason why empaths are very often hunted by psychopaths, also known as personality disordered individual, NPDs, narcs. In other words, the dangerous match that is happening very systematically between empaths and psychopaths. What makes the empath a magnet for the exploitative, manipulative, controlling, and predatorial individuals known as NPDs or other predators who will systematically seem to hunt empaths in the same manner that the predators of the oceans, sharks, are zeroing in on vulnerable creatures, on blood. Energy vampires will magnetically hunt empath. Why is this? Well, very simply, because there is an alchemy of transformation that happens with early life trauma. And the way that alchemy of transformation happens sends people in two opposite directions. There are those who, hit by trauma in early life, become predators. And we know that in criminal profiling, it's long been proven that serial killers, repeat offenders, criminals, and otherwise harmful individuals always have a common denominator, or more often than not, have a common denominator in early life where they sustained violent trauma. And what happens is the mind unable, the brain unable to process that trauma, will take on coping mechanisms that in their case become exploitative and harmful to others. So with NPDs, with narcs, with narcissistic personality disordered individuals, we know it's often very well documented that the soul, so to speak, was extinguished by the trauma and the ego rose to the surface to function and operate. In the case of empath, I see that as the equal opposite, exact opposite, in that the ego was extinguished by the trauma and solely the soul surfaced. So in the same way that you have trauma sending people in groups of people in a direction towards predatorial behaviors, we also know in the same manner that the same trauma will send another group of people towards the exact opposite, which is crime fighters, public defenders, first responders, people who embark on a mission to be the voice for the voiceless and serve the vulnerable. So same trauma, exact polar opposite reactions. So in the empath, we have the obliteration of the ego and the soul remaining. In the psychopath or NPD, we have the obliteration of the soul and the ego remaining to the surface. So what happens when you have an ego without a soul that is a starved entity that is fundamentally empty and permanently left to seek immediate external gratification in a compulsive need to fill the internal void. So they will hunt you, the empath, like the dead run after the light, so to speak, and never be satisfied because nothing will be able to fulfill their emptiness for long enough. So how does that obliteration happen? Well, early life trauma. Well, you have events that are too startling for the soul to process. And in the case of exploitative predators, they will put on the coping mechanism that allows them to function at that time and then sends them on a path where they will be fundamentally devoid of empathy, inability to feel other people's emotions. They will lack sense of honor, duty, ethics, commitment, or moral, and will be left seeking external gratification and immediate fulfillment of their needs at all cost without regard for the consequences. In the empath, we have the exact opposite. We often have people who were shaken and traumatized in early life and brainwashed to believe that their needs don't matter. They have no right to have personal needs. Their safety doesn't matter. And they are alive to serve the needs of others. In other words, the early life abusers. So that's an early life programming that leaves people known as empath with porous boundaries. So a lack of knowledge in the ability and right to establish proper boundaries for their own needs and safety and wellness and protection. They are filled with guilt, shame, and blame that was embedded into their mind by the early life abusers, which predators will take advantage of. And they have an extremely developed sense of honor, commitment, ethics, moral duty that will be, taken advantage of very strongly by predatory types of individuals. So in terms of obliteration of the ego, as someone who has survived extreme violent trauma through the course of my journey, and over the course of the last several years, attempting to survive a vendetta to end my life, the symptoms left by extreme and complex post-traumatic stress will lead sometimes to what the medical field labels as depersonalization, dissociation, traumatic depression, anxiety, and panic, where your ego is so obliterated that you no longer even feel linked to your personality. So we know that we are not our bodies. Our bodies are constantly changing through the course of our journey. Medical science tells us every 7 years, I believe, we have an entirely new body as our cells age and shed and are replaced by brand new cells. We know that we're not our brain either. Our brain is mainly our operating software, enabling us to function within our body. And we're not our personality either. Our personality is a well-rehearsed act. In fact, the word itself, personality, comes from the Latin persona, which means actor. So we're playing an act. And so we become very used to that, and we feel associated to that, and we feel identified by our body and our brain and our personality, but all of these are our instruments. And when trauma obliterates you, it basically burns all of this. And in my case, I became so depersonalized during the course of the last few years that I would tell my friends, my circles, that I no longer felt as a woman or a man. And so of course they would laugh, saying, "Oh, trust me, Genviève, you're very much a woman." And I told them I could no longer feel that I had any personality, to which again they would laugh and say, "Trust me, you have a personality, a strong personality," but you become so disconnected with it. Time and space become sort of irrelevant. So that is the death of the ego, where all you melt down to is basically life, that energy that is within your body, that is far above and beyond the body, the brain, the personality, and the ego. Total detachment that can also lead to, in my case, of course, prefrontal cortex downregulation with trauma and the fight or flight mode, loss of coordination, loss of motor skills, loss of balance, time and space perception, total death of the ego. It's very troubling. And of course, in those moments, you need to be surrounded by a strong medical team and a strong mental health care team that will help you rebuild your sense of safety. But at the same time, that loss of the ego allows you to recreate yourself and rise from your ashes more authentic than you ever were before, because all of the false selves are being burned. So what are the main traits of empath? We know that empath and psychopath are dramatic polar opposites, and that's why the empath are such a perfect match for the predator. Empaths, of course, are filled with empathy. That's the main characteristic. Through the roof with empath, non-existent with NPDs. Empaths have a strong sense of honor, ethics, morals, duty, commitment, personal responsibility that is taken advantage of massively by exploitative individuals. They are trained at birth to have no boundaries once again, and that is also exploited by NPDs and manipulative types of personalities. The trademark of an empath is that they feel and absorb other people's emotions as if they were their own, sometimes not even able to differentiate between what is another person's emotions and what is your own emotions, because you feel them so powerfully, so potently. Also known as well to even absorb physical symptoms. And that's happened to me so many times where I'm working with somebody, and in my intent to remove the symptoms they're attempting very desperately to release, very often I find myself taking them on. That's been known with shamans and healers through the history of humanity, soaking in other people's diseases and symptoms in order to free others. Empaths are known for that. When surrounded by peace and love, the empath will flourish and open up, and body, mind, magnificently fulfilling with the correct environment. However, when surrounded by negative emotions and negative moods, they become rapidly drained. Empaths are highly sensitive. Through the thick and thin, they will be here for you, caring, nurturing, on a mission to help and serve. They are the intense responders to other people's suffering. And they feel emotions on a very large scale. They're very easily impacted and hurt, often told they're too sensitive. They also have very highly tuned senses, becoming therefore sensitive to sounds, to noise, to scents, or even simple things like excessive talking. Many empaths, for those reasons, become introverted. They feel overwhelmed in crowds. They prefer one-to-one contact or smaller groups, or limit the amount of time they spend in larger groups. Very highly intuitive, of course. Empaths experience the world through their intuition, their gut feeling. So we now know, with the development of science and medicine and psychology as well, that there is an intelligence in the body, there is an intelligence in the gut that is very often much more in tune with the reality that is surrounding us than the intelligence of the brain, simply because the brain is constantly logically analyzing and comparing data to previous experiences, whereas the gut is simply communicating what it receives purely without any sort of corruption from other situations. So the empath will find positive relationships very nurturing, and will also be targeted by energy vampires attempting to draw the life force away from their body. They therefore need also to retreat, to prevent themselves from becoming drained. And that's why very often, so I thought this was simply a symptom of post-traumatic stress and injuries received, that I found it so difficult, if not impossible, to travel in other people's vehicles these days. Well, empaths are known to like to take their own cars when they go places, just so that they can leave and retreat when they feel the need to do so. So that's also a characteristic of the empath. They can become overwhelmed in relationships simply because they have this compelling need to help others, and the tendency to absorb the negative emotions of others in order to protect them. So they become very rapidly drained, and therefore have to learn to establish proper boundaries. Empaths have huge hearts and are known to give and selflessly devote themselves to others. So again, that can make them targets from the manipulative and controlling individuals, and targets, of course, for energy vampires. Their sensitivities are the absolute gold mine for the exploitative individuals whose fear and rage can download into the empath loving and supporting modus operandi, so to speak. Another characteristic is empaths are deeply moved by beauty, and especially natural beauty, and that's why they become replenished in nature, with wilderness surrounding them, oceans and water in general, which helps them release the burdens, take refuge from the day-to-day stress and overwhelming demands placed on them, and restore and regenerate. So these are the main traits of empath, and now the action steps that we can take in order to protect ourselves from the predatorial types is, number one, very importantly, to learn to read and trust our intuition and our gut feeling. And not only that, but to listen to it and follow through, no matter what our mind tells us, because our mind will make excuses, our mind will doubt and lead us to continuously give second chances. So learning to trust our intuition and our gut feeling and act accordingly, protecting, preserving, and nurturing ourselves. And that's what I teach people who work with me, going back in time to rescue the younger one, the child within. And once you have that child within, then it becomes immensely easier to take that child's safety as a priority and say zero tolerance to violence, and learn to establish proper boundaries and learn to make that child's priority that child's wellness your priority, basically, which is harder to do, especially for empaths and especially for survivors of early life trauma, because we were taught that we had no right to safety. So learning to rescue the younger one within and making their wellness your top priority makes it easier. And lastly, to see the red flags and label them as deal breakers, not only simply red flags, but deal breakers, in knowing that those individuals who are exploitative, manipulative, and harmful, who turn your words against you, who use your wounds to destabilize you and break you, are not allowed to be in your circle. So as I said in my last video last week, the motto, the mantra becomes turn around, walk away, and live another day. Turn around, walk away, and live another day. Pardon my French accent, still trying to speak your language. So this is a mantra that was given to me by a former lieutenant in the Foreign Legion anti-terrorist unit with whom I was combat training for many, many years. And that applied to combat training. But again, when we're interacting with predators, they are extremely harmful, and the same measures, the same commitment and the same discipline needs to be applied as predators in the street. Turn around, walk away, and live another day. So with these words, I leave you. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Always a pleasure interacting with each and every one of you.